Hi, this is Charlie Mato-Toyela from Blue Bear Flutes. Of course, you can find us on bluebearflutes.com and Blue Bear Arts and Blue Bear Flutes on Facebook and gosh, just about everywhere. Don't forget our Instagram account. We post a lot of really neat stuff there. So today, what we're talking about is actually one of the secrets of Native American flute making. And it's not really so much a secret as it's a concept that I feel that many people don't understand or wouldn't really even know how to understand in some ways. So I wanted to bring some light to it and show you how it is we do it here at Blue Bear Flutes. Now, of course, other flute makers do things a little differently than us. I've met a few that do them like we do to some degree, and a lot of them that really do them on the other end of the spectrum. We use a lot of old technology and new technology and different systems to do things today that are very similar to the way that people did them a long time ago. So a lot of the flutes that we make now, though we may make them out of a different wood or use a tool to make them with, traditionally made instruments are some of the most important things to us, and to keep the tradition alive of how to make flutes the way that people used to make them is also important. So we have classes varying, here and there. We've given them over the years on how to make flutes out of different materials. In front of me here I have some actual river cane. This is a piece of natural river cane here that we use to make flutes out of. It's a small piece. It's actually about the size of the cane that we used to have both in Texas and Oklahoma when we lived there, and it's not uncommon at all throughout the United States. This particular species of river cane gets larger than this quite a bit. I don't know if I have any pieces laying around. Here's a slightly larger one here, which is basically big enough to stick this little guy into. This was a lot less common back in the old days simply because the patches where this particular cane grew were usually harvested for making baskets. So likewise, there were a handful of flute makers, but most flute makers used out of the common materials and things that made more sense and easier to use, which was more like this. So, and of course, that species of river cane gets bigger even. River cane is a different plant than bamboo, for example. It's a similar family, but it grew up a little differently than bamboo did, so it grows differently than bamboo does. The links on one of the indigenous species of river canes in the United States, the large one, gigantea people call it, they actually go almost 3 feet between this node, this partition inside of the flute. The partition inside of the reed itself is there to help give it some stability, hold in moisture, and do some other things. We've talked about this in other videos. This is a piece of sawgrass. This piece of sawgrass is actually pretty large compared to what most of you may be able to find in the United States. Fortunately, I know where it looks. It comes out pretty good. We've had pieces of sawgrass that almost were the same size as our river cane, but they're very, very far and few in between. And this sawgrass is the size material, just like the river cane, that indigenous peoples in this country, in the United States, used to use for making flutes. The size of the material being the key word and very, very important. The size of the material that people had determined the type of flutes they were able to make. Whether it be a small flute like this, which have been historically discovered, or a slightly larger one like this, which is just barely big enough to stick my little finger in, which is still very historically prevalent, I guess, in Native America. And then on occasion you would find one that was almost as big around as this Western cedar flute. Now, the outside of the Western cedar flute is one thickness, of course, but because the inside is a different thickness, it would actually produce a slightly different tone. So all that having been said, this flute makes kind of a high tone, and I know we've discussed that in the past where the indigenous flutes, the original flutes, were almost always higher tone. So, all that aside, what this video is about is basically traditional tuning. And a lot of people get hung up on these mathematical concepts and numbers and forget that we're living in the now culture. And the now culture doesn't always see past maybe 100 years ago, past maybe 2 generations is about as far as we see. And very few of the now culture ever look to the future, which is really not good. Kind of a native concept that might be a good one to adopt. But the now culture forgets that it's only been a few hundred years since the whole Gregorian and Pythagorean movement to music has really taken place. Prior to that, most musical instruments may have been tuned to themselves, to each other, to a group, Even in Europe, for example, where the whole Gregorian and Pythagorean movement took place, originally, the old days, people played instruments that were not tuned to a European scale, as I like to call it. So these days, of course, we tune a plethora of instruments to European scales. We tune our flutes to European scales, of course, but you tune guitars to European scales. You tune them everything to A through G, and those notes are what determines how the flute sounds or how the guitar sounds. Back in the old days, people didn't have one of these fancy tricorders here, these Star Trek implements of Spock's. They didn't have something like this to tune to. So in Europe and throughout a lot of the Swiss countries, which were well known for making said devices, they actually had a tuning fork, which I have a couple of. Tuning forks were a good way in the old days to tune an instrument because they remained relatively consistent if you kept them polished. If you didn't keep them polished, they rust. Eventually the rust causes the tuning to go out of whack and you're kind of back to square one again, tuning this thing by ear. Which today, as I understand it, many piano tuners still tune by ear. They use different tools. Most of them don't even use electronics these days. Most of them stick with the tuning forks because their level of consistency, but they still rely on the ear. We still even rely on the ear to make sure this flute sounds good. If I look down at the tuner and it says it's perfectly in tune, but maybe just a little bit this way and the other notes are a little bit that way, I'll tune it by ear to make sure it's right. Because that's what really boils down to, is you want an instrument that sounds good tuned by ear. So, on our website, we offer flutes that are traditionally tuned. You may find one or two other flute makers out there that tune their flutes by ear, and they may call them grandfather tuned or a couple of other things, naturally tuned, tuned to itself, a few things like that. And of course, sometimes a tuned to itself flute will be great and sometimes it will not be. It just really depends on the experience of the person tuning the flute. I'm going to give you an example of what a flute sounds like when we make this thing from our bass pattern, which is based on an old Cherokee flute, and I'm going to let you hear what it sounds like without tuning the holes at all. They're just drilled to 3/16 of an inch. Sounds really close. Bottom note's just a little flat, I can hear. These notes aren't too bad. These here are incredibly flat, which, once again, what made it a traditionally tuned instrument in the first place? Well, the inside diameter matches the size of a historical instrument. That's the first thing. The finger hole placement are relatively consistent with that particular instrument. Now, they're not the same size and diameter at the moment because tuning really should happen at the end of flute creation, not necessarily at the beginning. There are flute makers out there that just pop flutes out all day long, and once in a while I'll receive one of their flutes that I need to retune, and every once in a while I'll hear from them and say, you know, I've got something that happened and my flute went out of tune, what happens? But basically people are following a pattern using the precise measurements, and it's just not playing exactly right. That's because one little thing changes up here in the sound hole, or maybe there's a piece of debris inside of it stuck somewhere that you can't get out, or perhaps there's a pit in the wood, or a softer spot of the wood, or a harder spot of the wood. Anything like that can cause a flute to go out of tune, which is why most of the mass production flute companies these days still go back and double check everything for quality control. Like I said, we like to tune them all one at a time, which takes a little bit of time and makes ours a little bit more valuable to me. Anyway, so what I've done is basically I've implemented a pattern that matches an old flute pattern. I've used the same size that matches that particular flute. I'm using a different wood than that flute's made out of, so that throws it off a little bit as well. But this is what a traditionally tuned flute, this is what it takes to make one traditionally tuned. Now I want to let you know, I'm not looking at this box. I'm not using a tuning rod. In the old days, for the most part, people didn't tune their flutes with a burning rod. It seems like old technology, and it may be of another sort. However, it was not something that Native Americans did. It's something I do because it's quick, convenient, and it does a number of things for me, which we've talked about in other videos. actually cauterizes the wood, which is important to me. Makes them last a lot longer. Very true to their performance as well. Now, to most of you, probably coming through your computer speakers or your cell phones or whatever tablet device you're looking at our video from, that may sound in tune to you. But on this end, I can hear subtle nuances. My hearing is relatively good. I can hear about 5 cents. A lot of you guys are thinking, oh, he's bragging. I can hear about 5 cents. Gosh, you do this all day long. I think it's a learned technique. That one actually sounds pretty good. For me, that's a traditionally tuned flute. One that used a traditional pattern that's based on the same size, that has the same shape, relative distance of fingerings. And a lot of you may think that where's your sixth hole? All Native American flutes were not 6-hole flutes. We've got videos on that. Please check them out. There were originally a lot of 4-hole traditional Native American flutes before any of these others were just come about into history. And about 3,000-4,000 years ago, people had a little more time on their hands and started making extra holes, and that's where we're at today. A lot of you that are interested in the original 6-hole flute, and we actually have a great video on making the traditional 6-hole flute. It's something very worth watching, in my opinion. I think that you might enjoy it and find something interesting in it, because a lot of the modern 6-hole flutes today use a relative traditional pattern within a certain range, and they make a flute that's not traditionally made because the inside diameter was ignored. The pattern that was used was one from a book, and the instructions were given from the book. However, the instructions from the inside diameter in the book weren't as exactly accurate with historical references, and likewise it turned out a little different. Those are the ones that you have to keep your finger covering the third hole all the time. So that is a traditionally tuned flute. The next thing we're going to do is take the same flute, which was originally, this is one of the flutes that historically was close to the key of A minor. Wasn't perfectly in A, but it was close. And we're showing about A at about 50 cents flat on 440. What we're going to do right now is take this guy over to my sander, and we're going to sand off about 1/4 of an inch of it, and you'll get to see where it goes from there. Now we're going to check the tuning to see if it's close. It may not be perfect just yet. I like to take my time on this kind of thing. And if you see me sand the edge of this off right here, it's because it was a rather sharp edge. Sharp edges on wood tend to flake off, so I usually take them off before I do anything else. Not too bad, 15-20 cents. Let's take off another 1/8 of an inch. Now let's see. And if you notice, I'm blowing hard at first, and then I started blowing soft, and it went flat again. That's because I try to tune this at a general airspeed that, you know, is relative to that of a, you know, general player, I guess is what you would say. So it goes 440A for me at a relative amount. I'm going to take off just a pinch more. I think we're probably done there. There we go, about 5 cents, 10 cents sharp, which is what I like to tune because I blow a little hard, and when most people play, here I'll show you, it'll be A440. So let's take it back over to the burning station and go from there. So I'll go ahead and play the first couple of bottom notes for you so that you can hear it and hear what it sounds like. To most people, it'll sound like it's in tune. I believe. And I can't play these two because they'll show you right off it's way out of tune. However, the bottom note is a A440. The next note, the C, is about 40 cents flat. So the way that we make the flute go sharp is making the hole larger, and that's why we use burning tools. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a little taper on the end of it. That taper will go from about 3/16 to about 5/16 and anywhere in between. And I like to keep them as true to their tone as possible. Now you can hear that third note there, the second fingering. You can hear it's really flat because the other two are. You can hear basically the variation because we have the one right next to it that is a little flat. These two notes here are only about a step apart, whereas these two notes here are about 3 steps apart. So that's where you get the difference in variation, why it is that this note can fool your ear when it's played next to this one when it's not in tune. However, this one in tune and that one not in tune, you know, the whole world's over. That note's very flat. Once again, taking off a little bit. Now it's perfect. Let's see what the next note sounds like. Still very flat. Once again, they're about a step apart from each other. This is A, C, D, and a flat E, which is now going sharp. I forget, if we made a video on how to make the flute go back flat if they made the hole too big? I don't remember if we did either. We probably ought to make another one of those anyway. Sounds much better, still just a pinch flat. Which all this is relatively consistent. I could actually go ahead and drill all my holes out to these sizes, and usually would be right, but I like to make sure that they're perfectly in tune. Much better. So this guy should be a G and it's shown in F sharp. Let's see what happens when we burn it out all the way. It's a G now, but it's just that much not sharp enough. So making the hole just a little bit bigger. That sounds good to probably your speakers as well. Very flat A. Let's see. Still flat. That should get it. Perfect. So that is a great A flute, and this guy here is based on, once again, the old pattern. Are all traditionally tuned flutes going to sound exactly like this one? No. No, as a matter of fact, by definition, if it has been tuned traditionally, then they probably are all going to sound very dissimilar from one another, or at least slightly dissimilar from one another, because originally people, once again, tuned by ear. They tuned based on the materials that they had at hand, and they tuned based on an effective working pattern that they were familiar with. They probably became familiar with it through friends, family, someone that they knew that had a flute, that had made one that worked out right, and here you go. The rest of them were probably firewood. So that happens. I mean, we've all done it. All flute makers have made a lot of firewood. So anyways, that's the difference between a traditional and a keyed flute or a tuned flute. One has been tuned to be articulately correct with, say for example, this one is an A minor flute. We make high D minor, C minor, B minor, A, G, F sharp, and then we go to E, D, and then the D's and the E's are kind of low tone flutes, and the C is what you guys would call a bass flute, and then we'll be offering other bass flutes in the very near future. So this is a great instrument. It's wonderful for beginners. You can play all of your favorite songs that you can play on any other Native American flute on it because they're all made similarly. So it doesn't really matter what key it is that the instrument is in, or whether it has been traditionally tuned or tuned with a tuner. You usually can still play your music on it. And just a little heads up on, delving into the original traditional instruments. I've actually been fortunate enough to meet some flute makers that, don't really see a lot of other things than flutes these days. And they make a lot of clay flutes, and some of them, it's their family traditions making these clay flutes. And the clay flutes don't always turn out perfectly in tune with each other. They don't turn out perfectly in tune with the pattern, for example. If they're making one that's supposedly in a major scale, it may not be perfectly in a major scale. But I've heard these guys play every song you can imagine. Anything from country music to, classical music and pop culture songs. I've heard them play on these instruments because it wasn't the flute that was playing the flute, it was the musician playing the flute. It really made a difference. Having said that, like I said, this traditionally tuned instrument, traditionally made instrument, in so many respects is very, very much the way that people would have made them a long time ago. And this one here is similar, but it's also tuned to the key of A minor, which is cool. And then this other guy, once again. So a lot of you probably are listening and saying to yourself, well, I really like the sound of that one. It sounds much softer and more mellow and whatever. That's almost something of a luck of the draw, as both flutes are pleasing to the ear. However, this one here is made in a scale that your ears are accustomed to hearing, and this one's made in something new. And grass is always greener on the other side, is what they say. So your ears tend to like something that may not be what you've heard before. However, great instrument, and I think you guys will definitely love it. At least history has shown that you've loved our traditionally tuned flutes. All the customers, my goodness, lots and lots of customers. Thank you all so very much. We appreciate you. Part of the reason we like to make these videos is to show that and to help you learn something about Native American flutes that maybe you haven't seen before, thought of, or considered, and in most cases it's something definitely different. So once again, this is Charlie Mato-Toyela signing out for Blue Bear Flutes, bluebearflutes.com. If you have any questions, as always, please comment on the video to let us know how you like it or what we could do differently. And if you have requests of different videos, or if you have questions about flute making or flute playing, always best to contact us through our website, Blue Bear Flutes. There's a contact form on the bottom of just about every page where you can send us a message. We also have an 800 number you can find us at the top of the page. Thank you guys so very much again, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Y'all take care.